Hey guys, I'm back with you guys for the Western Theater here today. I'm going to again try to do 10 minutes quick, get you through all the battles of the Western Theater. Obviously you guys already know these because it's the presentations from class this week, but just to help you study for your quiz and just so you don't forget anything, I'm going to go through them today. First is Fort Henry and Fort Donelson, which are two battles along the Mississippi/Tennessee River where Grant proves that he's an effective leader. Fort Henry falls almost immediately, and the Confederate troops from Fort Henry actually head over to Fort Donelson. And that's the one where Grant lays, or sets up for sort of a siege of Donelson. And he sends a couple of waves of troops in to try to take it, and both times is repelled. So as he's sort of digging into siege, the Confederates launch an attack out of Fort Donelson to try to break Grant and his siege. And he barely holds and turns it around, and soon Fort Donelson falls. The significance of these two battles are, of course, that the Union idea to win, one of their ideas is to take that entire Mississippi River and choke out the Confederacy. Obviously, once they do that, which we're going to see with Vicksburg in a second, that's sort of the last of the big battles along the Mississippi, they then have cut the Confederacy, three of the states of the Confederacy out. And they obviously control the entire river, as well as the blockade that's going on of all the eastern ports. Shiloh, this is one of the bigger battles of the Western Theater. And this is where Grant is getting beaten. He's drilling his troops, and he sort of gets surprised. And the Confederates launch an attack on him. I believe that was Bragg. And he gets sort of pushed back towards the river. And fortunately, just in time, Buell arrives and reinforces Grant. And the next day, and says, oh, we got. The quotation is something like, they got whooped today. And Grant says, yeah, we'll get them tomorrow, or we'll get them the next day. And they do. With the reinforcements from Buell, Grant pushes Bragg back and wins at Shiloh. The next one's the siege at Vicksburg. Remember, this is July 4th. The end of Gettysburg was July 3rd. The Confederates were retreating on July 4th. This is the major turning point in the war. And Vicksburg is a city along the Mississippi, along the Mississippi River, a fortified city that eventually, after a long siege where famously people were eating rats and dogs and whenever they could find because the siege had choked off all supply lines, that they eventually surrendered. And this surrender, coupled with Gettysburg, ends up being the major turning point in the war. And this is the one, as I said previously, that gives the Union the entire length of the Mississippi without any artillery, forts, etc., that can fire on those ships, which makes a big difference for moving troops, for moving supplies, and reinforcing, the way that Grant was reinforced by Buell in the last battle I was just talking about at Shiloh. The next two are Chickamauga and Chattanooga. Chattanooga is a major transportation hub, base of supplies for the Confederate Army in the South. And Rosecrans, I believe, is the general of the Union general that fights at Chickamauga. The Union had captured Chattanooga, the Confederates retreated, and the Bragg wanted it back. So he launches an attack at Chickamauga en route to get to Chattanooga and succeeds. Rosecrans makes a huge error at Chickamauga where he thinks that there's a hole, he is told that there's a hole in his lines. So to reallocate troops, he moves troops, allocates them to where he believes this hole is, and actually creates a hole in doing that to plug a non-existent hole, which was silly. And the Confederate General Longstreet exploits that gap. The Union retreats, heavy losses, although both sides had plenty of losses that day. And then the following battle is for Chattanooga. Again, this is the supply hub. The Confederates, I believe it's called the Gateway to the South. And the Confederates are trying to recapture it from the Union. But Grant succeeds in keeping the supply lines open so the Confederates can't, at least one, so the Confederates can't effectively siege him, starve him out until he surrenders. And he gets reinforcements from Sherman. William Tecumseh Sherman, who we're going to see when we get down low to this last one, Atlanta, and his march to the sea, which I'm saving for last because I like it. He comes in with about, I think, 50 to 70,000 troops, lots of troops to reinforce Grant, and then Grant is able to crush Bragg at Chattanooga. Bragg actually had reduced force numbers too because Longstreet was no longer with him because Longstreet hated him and was mad at him after some mistakes. Anyway, So Grant gets his victory at Chattanooga. That's the gateway to the South. This is then now the new Union hub of supply, transportation, etc., thanks to that victory. Next three battles, these kind of go together. They're part of what's called Grant's Overland campaign. Grant, now the leader of the Union forces in the Western Theater, is relentless. He goes after the Confederates, day after day. The difference between Wilderness and Spotsylvania is 1 day. It's 1 day turnaround time, or maybe 2. 1 day between the Wilderness and Spotsylvania. Both of these, numbers-wise, go in favor of the Confederates. They have a smaller force than Grant, so he can afford to give up these casualties that he suffers in all three of these battles, Cold Harbor being the worst in terms of percentage-wise. But anyway, the point of these three, and not to talk to any of these in detail, but that Grant, between the Wilderness battle when he loses more troops, but again, Lee's retreating, tries again at Spotsylvania a day later, same thing, launches offensives against what he thinks is a more favorable position in Spotsylvania, tries again, launches offensives, again loses a lot of men. And then between Spotsylvania and Cold Harbor, it's like a 10-day turnaround. So after Spotsylvania, Grant gears up again and launches offensive on Cold Harbor. This ends up being something that he regrets in the end, because he sends in so many troops that just get destroyed by Confederates that are well entrenched with artillery. And as Mr. Custer talked about with you guys when we went to the Civil War encampment, this is the battle where 7,000 Union men fell in 20 minutes. And as Mr. Custer told you, these are the battles where when Grant said, "Gear up, we're going again," the men cheered, even though their chances of dying was greatly increased when they were just going to continuously pursue Lee. But they wanted to end this war. And as I was saying, Grant just has that many more troops, and he's willing to pound to make Lee surrender. And he eventually does that by taking Petersburg. Richmond, of course, is the capital of the Confederacy. Petersburg is the hub that supplies Richmond and thus the Confederate Army in the East. And Grant's idea is to go take Petersburg, and that's how he will get Richmond. They're connected by rail, and Petersburg has lots of rails that connect it. And Grant's idea is to cut those off one by one. And so he's basically surrounding Petersburg, and it takes him months to do this. He's continuously trying to sort of flank and push the Confederates back towards Petersburg while he's cutting off their rail lines so that he can effectively complete a siege. And as I said, it takes him a very long time, but he eventually does siege Petersburg. And when Petersburg falls, the Confederates retreat, and they leave Richmond too. Because there's not much of a battle here with Richmond, but by taking their hub of operations in Petersburg, the Confederacy has to leave Richmond too, and not long after that, the war is over. The other big siege in the South is for Atlanta. This is called Sherman's. Well, this is the beginning of Sherman's march to the sea, and he's using his supply lines are coming from Chattanooga. Remember that. And this is another effective siege on Atlanta. Sherman surrounds the city, effectively takes Atlanta, goes in, uses, resupplies, restocks, and then famously burns all of Atlanta. His troops are running around the city with torches, burning it to the ground. And this becomes his idea of how to win the war, total war, where you're waging war on the enemy forces, which they had been doing previously, but also on the enemy population and obviously supplies, factories, whatever. So Sherman then marches from Atlanta all the way to Savannah, and he's burning a 60-mile wide trail the whole way there. Anything that could possibly help the Confederate Army, he's destroying. And he becomes famous for this. And then when he gets to Savannah, Savannah falls, and then he plans to go up into the Carolinas and do the same. So in the same way that the Union took the Mississippi River, you see then Sherman moved from Atlanta across Georgia to Savannah, and then he's going up to the Carolinas. And that's when we have Appomattox Courthouse, where Lee surrenders to Grant, and just days later the same happens with the forces that are fighting in the Western Theater, which is more the Southern Theater, obviously, as we already know. So this is sort of the end of the war. It is the end of the war. These battles are what lead us to the agreement at Appomattox Courthouse. And as you can tell, this is where the war changes. I mean, Gettysburg was sort of the one, other than Antietam, which was only so much of a victory. Gettysburg was sort of the big victory for the Union up in the Eastern Theater. And then here, there's a couple of huge successes in terms of, and almost always sort of cutting the Confederacy up geographically, but taking their supply lines, all the while pounding at their forces. And this is, of course, where we find Grant and Sherman, who are the two Union generals at the end of the war that are willing to relentlessly pursue and destroy until Lee gives up. And he eventually does. And herein ends the Civil War. Your test is on Tuesday. Watch this over the weekend. If you don't get to it Monday night, I hope that you guys can both talk about what happened in each battle and what the significance of these battles were. I'll see you in class on Monday.